Hi, I'm Julia Maddock, and today we're going to be looking at an analysis of the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation COVID-19 forecasting model. So this information is an update based off of the information that we've been able to look at since April 21st when the last update was recorded. So this video is going to include 3 additional models that we have been able to look at since then. So as an introduction, the COVID-19 virus has had a major effect on the economy. We've seen that in financial markets in terms of volatility, agricultural markets, and most recently in the oil markets when oil prices went negative last week. Additionally, we're seeing huge impacts in terms of U.S. unemployment. At this point, we've had more than 26 million workers file for unemployment due to a significant share of the economy being shut down. And so this IHME model at the University of Washington is playing a large role in the formation of policy. We're seeing governors, local decision makers, and other lawmakers start to refer to this model in terms of making decisions and trying to determine how we're going to move forward from this virus. And so it's important to understand and document the performance of the prediction model and the revisions that are being made as we move forward and start to learn more about the virus and get more data. So again, this is an update of the April 21st discussion, and we're going to have 3 more released models to look at. As an overview of the IHME modeling approach, this is a statistical forecasting model using a parameterized spline. So it's using curve fit via Python and fit in a log space. So this assumes a sigmoid shape or a logistic function, which we can kind of see in the right over here, and uses a bounded nonlinear optimization problem, which is an algorithm that requires derivatives. Most of the information used for this model comes from local and national governments, as well as the World Health Organization website. In addition, the Johns Hopkins coronavirus data. So as of today, April 28th, this article has not completed the full peer review process. In addition to this model, some of the information that we used in terms of actual data and actual deaths came from this Worldometers website and the covidtracking.com website. This is a full list of the states included in the slides, and then today I'm going to go over some of the more interesting and notable cases that are maybe relevant to the news cycle today and some of the more interesting things that we have seen. So to start off, we're going to look at the Kansas COVID-19 daily death projections. Here, this purple line is the mean projected daily deaths, what IHME was expecting the mean death to be in Kansas per day on March 26th. And then these green lines here mark the upper and lower bound of the forecast. So essentially the bounds say with 95% confidence that the actual data will fall between these 2 means. And so the good news is that what Kansas has experienced so far has been pretty well below that lower bound. We haven't experienced only, really one day have we experienced these daily deaths go over 10, and otherwise we have been pretty far below this lower bound here. And so that has been positive and been interesting to look at as Kansas moves forward, how the daily deaths will progress. In terms of the U.S., this is the same type of approach. We're looking at the mean daily deaths projected in the U.S., along with the upper and lower bounds. So you can see in the case of the U.S., the model has been a little bit more accurate in tracking this mean. We've seen the actual data go up and down as to be expected, but in general, it's falling pretty close to this mean and within the upper and lower bounds. So we can see the model, the March 26th model has been pretty accurate in tracking how the U.S. Daily death projections would play out. Looking at New York has arguably been the hardest hit hotspot within the states. We've seen other hotspots pop up, but none have really been hit as hard as the state of New York has. And so we can see from this March 26th model that New York's actual daily deaths have actually now exceeded not only the mean, but they're falling outside of the upper bounds. And so New York has been hit harder than what the model estimated it to be on March 26th. And so the model under forecasted what was going to occur in New York. Looking at California, California has been an interesting case in terms of deaths because, similar to New York, it is pretty densely populated, but we have not seen near the outbreak in California and the number of deaths that we've seen in New York. So as you can see, the upper and lower bound are pretty wide in the case of predicting what was going to happen in California. But for the most part, the daily deaths have tracked right along the mean. We've seen some variance, given different days, but we're pretty much staying within these bounds and following the mean. So it will be interesting to see in the next couple days where this red actual line starts to go, if it continues to maybe trend down some or continue kind of on this sideways movement here along the mean. In terms of Florida, Florida's actions in terms of shutdowns in the pandemic have been in the news recently. As we know, last week, Florida opened all its beaches, but we really have not seen a large outbreak in Florida at all. If you look at the mean, Florida's actual daily deaths have tracked pretty well below that mean, and again are starting to fall out of the lower bound there of what was expected March 26th. So Florida has tracked pretty well below, and we haven't seen as much model accuracy in Florida. Georgia has also been a state that's been in the news quite a bit recently because Georgia's beginning to open their state now. We're seeing some non-essential businesses go back with pretty minimal restrictions. So it's interesting to look at how the actual data has tracked here in terms of the mean predicted for Georgia on March 26th. We've seen a significant amount of variance, really the high up here being around 100 and the low maybe close to 5 to 10. So really a great deal of variance in terms of what's going on in Georgia and how that's tracking along the mean with what was a pretty narrow prediction interval on March 26th. So it will be interesting to see in the next few days as Georgia continues to open where this actual line starts to go. If we're going to see a spike again in daily deaths as they start to open, or maybe if it will start to trend downwards. So Georgia will be one to keep looking at. Massachusetts has been a huge case of underprediction in terms of the model. If you look at the original estimated mean, the peak was right here at about 80 days. And the daily deaths, we saw a peak close to almost 180. So the model has really underpredicted in the case of Massachusetts, and we're seeing a much larger outbreak there than was anticipated. So that will be interesting to continue following as we move on where this line is really going to go in terms of the model forecast. Washington, we've also seen huge variance in terms of actual deaths since then. As you can see, this purple mean here really had a pretty wide prediction interval, and so we really only stepped out of that a little bit right here, but there's been really a huge amount of variance in Washington's actual and really hasn't tracked along the mean as much as we have expected it to at all. And so this wide prediction interval does tell us that the model was not as confident in forecasting this prediction. So we're kind of seeing some of that uncertainty now as the actual data has tracked pretty well above or below the expected mean. Colorado, another interesting case, as we initially saw a high number of cases there, people traveling through the Denver area. As you can see in March 26th, the curve really was expected to peak pretty high up here at around 80 deaths, and Colorado's actual has stayed well below that. So the model really overpredicted in Colorado, and we're seeing that with the peak right now in daily deaths being right here. So in the next few days, it will be interesting to see how this line continues to trend. If we go more sideways movement, go down, or if we see another spike as state restrictions begin to ease. Missouri has experienced a lot of variance in their daily prediction as well. As you can see, the mean deaths were expected on March 26th to not peak till about March 13th, but Missouri has announced as of Monday that they will be easing all restrictions and reopening the economy. And for the most part, I mean, you could say on average that Missouri actuals have tracked along this mean, but really we've seen a lot of variance in terms of the highs and the lows down here. So it will be interesting to watch Missouri as they start to open back up, what we're going to see, if we're going to see a big jump in cases or a continual kind of sideways trend here. This is just looking at some forecasting performance of the March 26 model daily death projections. Primarily, we want to look at this bias over here. And so when we estimated the forecasting performance, bias was estimated as the forecast minus the actual. So all of these areas here where we have positive bias mean that the model over-predicted the actual deaths that occurred. And so the positive is that we're seeing a lot of positive bias over here. In the case of the U.S., California, Florida, we only see a relatively small bias number in terms of Illinois. The really notable one here is New York and how much the model underpredicted what was going to happen in New York on March 26th. So jumping over from daily deaths, we're going to look at cumulative death projections. This is the March 29th cumulative death projection for Kansas. So as you can see again, Kansas is tracking pretty well below that lower bound of what was initially expected March 26th, which really for Kansas is a real positive that we're experiencing less deaths than we expected to. Is really what we hope, you know, for all states, that it will not be as bad as we expected. And then in terms of the U.S., we're seeing a pretty similar pattern is what was originally projected. We've seen pretty high model accuracy for the U.S. in general, and the actual deaths tracking right along or pretty close to this mean that was projected March 29th. So in terms of the U.S. as a whole, this model has been relatively accurate in predicting where things are going to go. Again, with New York, we're seeing the same thing that we saw with the daily death projections. Not necessarily as much of a deviation between the actual data and the mean, but at this time, the actual data is tracking above the mean cumulative deaths that the model predicted March 26th. So we are seeing more of an under forecasting here, and it will be interesting to see where this kind of goes if New York continues to trend upwards or that curve really does start to flatten. In terms of California, again, California is tracking within the prediction interval here, but currently under the mean projected cumulative deaths that we saw March 26th. But we're still seeing a pretty significant relative amount of accuracy here. This is not straying too far from the mean and seems to be following this shape. So California will be one to watch in the next few weeks and see how that actual data continues to trend. Florida, as we saw in the daily deaths, has fallen pretty far below the mean estimated cumulative deaths. We're not outside that prediction bound yet, but Florida is really tracking right along the bottom of that lower bound as we look at this. And so it will be interesting to see how Florida continues to trend as they start to ease restrictions and reopen their economy. Illinois cumulative deaths, we've seen really a great deal of model accuracy so far in the Illinois projections. We can see this actual data tracking right along the mean as we move out. In terms of Georgia cumulative death projections, we have seen the actual deaths fall not only under the mean, but really outside of the lower bound at this point. As you can see, Georgia cumulative deaths tracking pretty far below what was estimated March 29th. And so Georgia, again, will be one to watch as we move forward, as they are one of the first states to start easing restrictions and opening businesses, many of which many other states have not allowed to be open yet, like tattoo parlors and other things where a lot of contact is necessary. So it'll be interesting to kind of watch Georgia and see how their deaths continue to trend as we move forward. Massachusetts cumulative death projections, like we saw with the daily death projections, the model really under forecasted what was going to happen in Massachusetts. As with daily deaths, the actual deaths are well outside not only the mean, but the upper interval at this point. And we're seeing a lot of deviation between the mean and the actual deaths. So really a lot of under forecasting of the model in the case of Massachusetts. Washington, we've seen a pretty reasonable amount of accuracy for their cumulative death projections. We're within the upper and lower bounds of the prediction. And for the most part, this actual death has followed the March 26th mean estimated death. Colorado, similar to daily deaths, cumulative deaths are tracking below the mean, and we are well outside of the lower bound expected on March 26th at this point. And so the model has really over forecasted what was going to happen in Colorado, and we're really seeing now the reduction in actual deaths versus what was expected just about a month ago. Missouri, for the most part, has had a pretty accurate cumulative death projection. At this point, the actual death has tracked pretty well along the mean and is now within both of those intervals. And so Missouri has seen pretty good accuracy with the model up to this point in terms of what was expected on March 26th. Looking at the forecasting performance of the March 26th model on cumulative death projections, what we've seen in the daily death projections pretty much holds true in the cumulative case as well. We're seeing a lot of positive bias, meaning that the model over forecasted what was going to happen, except for in the case of New York here, where we've seen pretty significant under forecasting and a lot of negative bias in terms of that. If you look at mean percentage error, which is just the absolute value of the error divided by the actual, represented as a percentage, we can see some pretty low percentage errors here in Illinois, New York, and the United States, and then some of those states that we talked about that are experiencing pretty significant deviations from what was predicted. We can kind of see those higher numbers in Florida, Kansas, and Texas. Looking at the forecasting performance of the COVID-19 daily death projections in Kansas, this kind of breaks down how long a model is really relevant before it kind of starts to fall apart and we see actual deviations that are pretty far from that forecast. And so what you can see here in terms of bias is that we really have pretty low bias the first few days. And then outside of that range, we start to see bias go up, percentage errors go up, and see a lot of variability. And the model starts to fall apart a little bit and not be as accurate. And we can kind of see the same thing here in terms of cumulative death projections. Right here at these first 3 days, we see pretty low bias. And then outside of that, again, the model starts to become less and less accurate. Which is why it's important to keep looking at these model revisions as they continue to be released. So this is looking at the projected date of maximum daily death, so really when the curve will peak in this model for various states. So looking at Kansas, what we've seen is that initially April 29th was the peak date. At some point, April 5th, we saw that peak move back a little bit, and then we have moved it forward, April 12th, moved it back, and now as of April 27th, the curve is now expected to peak on May 4th. We've seen that kind of volatility and kind of variance in when the curve is going to peak in other states and in the U.S. as well. We saw a little bit of moving around, not sure when that peak was going to be, and now looking back, it seems like pretty consistently we're saying that that peak was April 15th. Again, just looking at the projected cumulative death. So August 4th is when this model ends. And so kind of looking at how the cumulative death on August 4th has changed kind of gives us an idea of what deaths were expected with each model release. So we can really see in Kansas, we started off at a pretty high number here at 687. And as models were released, we walked it back a little bit. At one point, we were at 265, 187, and now looking at the most recent release, we're back at around 366. So there kind of have been some fluctuations as we've continued to get data and the model has made revisions, kind of looking at what the cumulative death will be. We've also seen that in New York. We started off with around 15,000 here, and looking at the most recent prediction, we're closer to 23,000. So as the model continues to change and we continue to get more accurate, more actual data, the model continues to make adjustments on what's to be expected. In terms of the U.S., we've seen a net overall decrease. We started at 82,000. We saw some numbers as high as 93,000. And now the most recent model predicts us down back at 74,000. So we've seen a net decrease overall since that March 29th model when we started looking at this. These are just a few more states that we can look at in terms of cumulative death. Colorado, we originally estimated 2,100. At some point, we dropped down April 5th to 302, and now we're back at roughly 1,000. So again, some fluctuation, but overall, we've seen a net decrease in what was expected. And so this slide just looks at the percentage change from the original model to the most recent April 26th release. Some states, as I mentioned, that were largely over forecast at the beginning have seen pretty significant drops in the percent change and what they now expect the death to be. Most notably, California has had a 53% decrease, Oklahoma 75% decrease, Missouri a 50% decrease, Texas 60%. So we're really seeing a great deal of decrease in maybe some of these less populous states or states that haven't been as hard hit. What we've really seen the increases are New York, which was to be expected as New York was a major hotspot. We saw just a slight increase in Nebraska, and then most notably this 200% increase in Massachusetts. So just some concluding thoughts that this model has been used to drive policy decisions that have resulted in really large negative economic effects for the U.S. in general and the agricultural market. So the change in data definition of death is really having an effect on the U.S. and New York projections along with other states. So this is making modeling extremely difficult, especially now as we start to have the conversation about what really results in a death from COVID-19 versus underlying conditions or maybe other causes. Fairly large revisions to the cumulative death totals and the peak of daily death totals have occurred both upwards and downwards depending on what state you're looking at and how really widespread that outbreak has been. And so really what everyone is wondering at this point is, are these revisions from the model due to society flattening the curve, or are they due to inaccurate models and forecasting errors, which we saw, over a month ago? So that will be something to continue looking at as we continue to get data and the situation continues to unfold. So thank you for listening and have a great day.